He confessed everything. The glowing rocks in his study were the source of the town's curse, a biological marvel that caused hallucinations before turning its victims to stone. "My family has been guarding this for a century," he said, his voice laced with regret. "You were exposed at the mine. You're contaminated. I can't allow you to leave." With the click of a lock, the scientist was trapped. How do you escape a ghost story when the ghost turns out to be horrifyingly real? In the sterile world of Dr. Evelyn Reed, truth was not a matter of belief, but of magnification. It lived in the elegant branching structures of a nerve cell, in the precise bloom of lividity on a corpse, in the cold, hard data scrolling across a monitor. Her laboratory was a temple to this truth, a fortress of steel and glass against the messy, unpredictable chaos of the world outside. Tonight, rain lashed against the panoramic windows, a frantic, unreadable Morse code. But inside, the only sound was the calm, steady hum of the air filtration system and the quiet clicks of her keyboard. On the massive screen before her, magnified 1,000 times, a slice of human tissue was rendered in false, vibrant color, a perfect, logical landscape of life's smallest components. To Evie, it was beautiful. It was knowable. She typed a series of precise, economical notes, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of a concert pianist. Everything had a place, a function, a reason. Cause and effect were the only gods she worshipped. On the corner of her desk, a single silver picture frame sat face down. It had been that way for 3 years. It was the one variable she could not control, the one data point that refused to fit into any equation, a ghost in her machine. So, she did what any good scientist would do, with an anomaly that defied explanation. She removed it from the observable universe. She focused on the work, on the clear, clean lines of cellular biology. Here, in the quiet hum of her sanctuary, she was in complete control. Here, there were no mysteries that couldn't be solved, only puzzles that hadn't yet been arranged in the right order. The sudden, sharp buzz of her phone was a violation. It ripped through the sterile air, an unwelcome intrusion from the world beyond the glass. Evie flinched, annoyed at the distraction. The screen glowed with a name she hadn't seen in years. Sheriff Cale. Brody Cale. A relic from a past she had neatly catalogued and filed away. She let it buzz a second time before answering. Her voice clipped, professional. "Reed. Evie? It's Brody. Brody Cale." His voice was thin, strained, crackling over a poor connection. He sounded older, worn down by something more than just time. "Sorry to call so late. I need a favor." Evie's posture stiffened. Favors were messy. They operated outside the clean confines of contracts and jurisdictions. "Brody, I'm a forensic pathologist for the state, not a private consultant. You know the protocol." I know, he sighed, a rush of static nearly swallowing his words. "But it's a weird one, Evie. We found a man out in the woods, local hunter, my coroner. Hell, Dave's been at this for 30 years and he's spooked. Says he won't touch him." Evie's professional curiosity stirred, a predator catching a scent. "Spooked? Coroners don't get spooked, Brody. They get busy." "Not like this," Cale insisted. His voice dropped lower, conspiratorially. "There's nothing. No wounds, no signs of a struggle, no ligature marks. Nothing. He just sat down and died. There's no discernible cause of death." The words snagged in her mind. No discernible cause of death. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of her entire belief system. To a scientist, it wasn't a mystery. It was an insult, a flaw in the data set that demanded correction. "Where is this?" she asked, her tone already shifting from dismissal to engagement. "A little town up in the mountains, place called Havens Deep. It's a drive, but I wouldn't be asking if I wasn't desperate. Can you come? Just look." She hesitated, her eyes drifting to the face-down photograph on her desk. She thought of the unsolvable thing it represented, the failure of her science, of her. The anger and frustration of it was a cold, familiar weight. But this was different. This was a problem she could solve. She had to. "I'll leave in the morning," she said, her voice all business once more. "Send me the coordinates." The next day, her sensible sedan felt like a spaceship, a sterile pod navigating a hostile alien planet. The highway narrowed, the asphalt crumbling at the edges as the Appalachian mountains rose up on all sides, a great green ocean threatening to drown the road. The trees were ancient, their branches interlocking overhead, casting the road in a perpetual twilight. Mist clung to the hollows, a soft white shroud over secrets she couldn't begin to imagine. Inside the car, the world was still hers. A dry academic voice droned from the speakers, the audiobook a treatise on advanced environmental toxicology. It was a shield of reason against the oppressive, primal beauty of the landscape. She was a creature of concrete and steel, and these mountains felt older than language, governed by rules she couldn't read. She passed a crude, hand-painted sign, the letters warped by years of rain and sun. Havens Deep, Pop, 412. The number felt less like a statistic and more like a warning. She was crossing a threshold, leaving the map of her known world behind. The audiobook narrator began a chapter on neurotoxins found in rare Amazonian fungi. But his voice sounded thin now, his logic a fragile thing against the immense, silent weight of the mountains. The clearing was a wound in the dense woods, a small patch of trampled earth under a grey, unforgiving sky. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of damp soil and decay. Sheriff Cale stood waiting, his shoulders slumped. He looked relieved to see her, as if her very presence, her sensible shoes, her practical jacket, her aura of sterile competence, was an anchor in a place that had come untethered from sense. "Dr. Reed, thanks for coming," he said, his voice low. He gestured with his chin toward a figure on the ground, covered by a drab, grey sheet. "He's over here. Name's Travis Miller, found by his brother this morning." Evie nodded, pulling on a pair of latex gloves with a sharp snap. "You haven't moved him?" "Didn't dare," Cale admitted. "Waited for you." She knelt beside the body, her movements precise. Cale reached down and lifted the sheet. The man, Travis Miller, was in his late 30s. He was dressed in hunting gear, propped against the base of an ancient oak tree. His eyes were wide open, fixed on something far away that only he could see. But it was his skin that made Evie's breath catch. It was pale, unnaturally so, with the smooth, matte finish of unglazed porcelain. She ran a gloved finger along his jaw. It was cold, but with a strange, rigid texture she'd never encountered. No wounds, no cyanosis, no sign of the violent struggle that accompanies most deaths in the wild. It was as if he'd simply stopped. Her mind, a machine built for patterns, began to cycle through possibilities. Fulminant septic shock, a catastrophic neurological event, anaphylaxis. Each hypothesis rose and fell in an instant, crashing against the stark, silent reality of the body before her. Her professional mask was firmly in place, but behind her eyes, a flicker of confusion, of profound and unsettling curiosity, ignited. This was not in the textbooks. As she began her preliminary examination, logging her observations into a small audio recorder, one of Cale's young deputies, a boy with nervous eyes, shifted his weight from foot to foot. He glanced at the body, then at the dark, encircling woods, and muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. The Blackwood Curse took him. Just like the others, the words, so alien to her world of measurable phenomena, landed like stones in the quiet clearing. Evie's head snapped up. Cale shot the deputy a look that could curdle milk, a silent, furious command to shut his mouth. But the idea was loose now, contaminating her crime scene with its pre-scientific filth. Evie's expression, already focused, hardened into one of dismissive annoyance. She deliberately turned her back on the deputy, her focus narrowing entirely on the sheriff. She didn't acknowledge the comment, didn't give it the dignity of a response. To do so would be to admit it into the realm of possibility. Instead, she reimposed her own world, her own language, onto the scene. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. "Sheriff," she said, her eyes still on the placid porcelain face of the dead man. "I'm going to need his full medical and dental records, a list of all known prescriptions, and I want to know everything he ate and drank in the last 48 hours. I'll start the real work back at your clinic." She paused, rising to her feet. "And tell your men that a curse has never stood up in a court of law, or in an autopsy." The clinic in Havens Deep was a relic, a testament to a time when medicine was more about hope than science. It served as the town's makeshift morgue, and the air inside was thick with the scent of antiseptic and old paper files. Under the constant, maddening buzz of a failing fluorescent light, Dr. Evelyn Reed began the real work. Sheriff Cale stood in the corner, a silent, uneasy spectator in her sterile theatre. The body of Travis Miller lay on a cold, steel table. In the harsh light, his skin looked even more like porcelain, flawless and inert. Evie made the first incision, a clean line down the center of the chest, but the sound was wrong. Instead of the soft parting of flesh, her scalpel produced a faint, grating noise, like a stylus dragging across stone. She paused, her brow furrowed. She pressed harder, the blade skittering slightly on the strangely resilient tissue. Cale shifted his weight. "Something wrong? The tissue degradation is atypical," Evie murmured, her focus absolute. She continued her work, her movements economical and precise, but with every layer she peeled back, the mystery deepened. The internal organs, while seemingly intact, had the same unnatural rigidity. When she placed a sample under her portable microscope, she saw it. Nestled within the muscle fibers, almost invisible to the naked eye, were delicate, crystalline structures, branching out like frost on a window pane. They were geometric, perfect, and utterly impossible. She had never seen anything like them. They weren't a product of any known disease or environmental exposure. They were alien. For hours she worked, her frustration mounting with each new piece of confounding data. She ran toxicology screens, searching for any known poison, from hemlock to polonium. The results came back clean. But the mass spectrometer, the machine that breaks down substances into their core elemental signatures, told a different story. It flagged trace metals in the victim's blood, but it couldn't identify them. The atomic weights didn't correspond to anything on the periodic table. They were ghosts in the machine, spectral fingerprints of an unknown element. Evie finally stepped back from the table, stripping off her gloves with a sigh of weary exasperation. Her scientific tools, her infallible extensions of logic and reason, were feeding her nonsense. They were showing her things that, according to the laws of biology and chemistry, simply could not be. "He wasn't poisoned," she said to Cale, her voice flat. "He wasn't sick. According to every test I have, this man was in perfect health. Except for the fact that he's dead, and part of him is turning into some kind of rock." Her fortress of logic had been breached, and the enemy wasn't superstition, but her own inexplicable data. The next morning, Evie sought refuge in the Havens Deep Diner. It was the only place that seemed fully alive, buzzing with quiet conversation and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The diner was also the town's unofficial museum. The walls were a collage of local history, framed sepia-toned photographs of men with hard faces and pickaxes, rusted mining tools mounted on wooden plaques, a yellowed newspaper article detailing a cave-in. The past wasn't just remembered here, it was curated. She sat in a booth, a lukewarm coffee at her elbow, her laptop open to a page of baffling spectrographic analysis. She was trying to force the impossible data into a logical framework, but it was like trying to teach a stone to fly. "You're the doctor from the state." It wasn't a question. Evie looked up to see a woman in her 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair the color of iron filings. She moved with a matriarch's easy authority, wiping down the counter as she spoke. This was Alara Vance. I'm consulting, Evie corrected automatically. Alara's eyes flickered to the photos on the wall. You're looking for answers in that machine, she said, her voice raspy but kind. The answers aren't in there. They're in the ground, in the memory of this place. Before Evie could offer a polite dismissal, Alara began to tell the story. She spoke of 1927, of the Blackwood mine, the town's lifeblood. She described the deep veins, the ones the company got greedy for, the ones that were unstable. She told of the day the earth shrugged, sealing 67 men behind 1,000 tons of rock and shale. There was no rescue. The company, Blackwood Industries, said it was too dangerous. They held a memorial, put up a plaque, and moved on. But the men didn't move on, Alara said, her voice dropping. The families. My great-grandmother was one of them. They could hear them, for weeks, cries and prayers, echoing up through the fissures in the mountain. Then, just silence. They say that before the silence, the dying laid a curse on this town, on the company that abandoned them, and the ground that entombs them. A promise that if they were to be forgotten, they would find ways to be remembered. Evie listened, her expression carefully neutral. It was a tragic story, a potent piece of local folklore born from unimaginable grief, a classic case of communal trauma expressing itself through superstition. She understood it from a psychological perspective perfectly. But as Alara spoke, Evie felt the woman was offering not a ghost story, but a history lesson, a form of knowledge as real and valid to her as any textbook. It was a narrative of cause and effect, just one that operated on a different set of rules. Seeking a more rational perspective, Evie drove to the address Sheriff Cale had given her for the town's most prominent citizen. The Blackwood estate sat on a hill overlooking Havens Deep, a grand, old house, impeccably maintained. It was a statement of endurance, a stark contrast to the slow decay of the town below. Jedediah Blackwood met her on the wide, sweeping porch. He was in his 60s, handsome and charismatic, with the easy smile of a man accustomed to being liked and respected. He was the grandson of the man who had owned the mine. Dr. Reed, it's an honor, he said, shaking her hand warmly. Anything I can do to help you and Sheriff Cale get to the bottom of this tragedy. He led her into a study filled with leather-bound books and geological maps. Evie explained what she was doing, carefully omitting the more inexplicable details of her findings. When she was done, Jedediah sighed, settling into a large armchair. It's the curse, of course, he said, his tone sympathetic, not superstitious. Not literally, you understand. You're a scientist, but the idea of it. This town has suffered, Doctor. The mine disaster. It left a wound that has never healed. It's a generational trauma, passed down. When something inexplicable happens like these recent tragic deaths, it's only natural for people to reach for the old stories. It's a way of coping. Evie found herself nodding. His explanation was logical, clinical even. Mass hysteria, psychosomatic suggestion. It was a plausible, scientific red herring. The human mind is a powerful thing, Jedediah continued, his voice smooth and persuasive. Fear can have very real physical consequences. If you want to understand what's happening in Havens Deep, don't look for a poison in the water. Look at the poison in the town's memory. He was offering her a way out, a neat psychological box to put the whole messy business into. It was tempting. It was an explanation that would fit, more or less, within the boundaries of her world. Her phone rang, shrill and demanding. It was Cale, his voice tight with panic. "Get down to the river," he said, without preamble. "South of the old bridge, it's happened again." The sun had set, and a thick, chilling fog was rolling off the water, swallowing the beams of their flashlights. Evie found Cale by the riverbank, standing over another body. A young woman, no older than 20, was sitting on a large, flat rock at the water's edge. Her posture was serene, her hands folded in her lap as if she were admiring the view. But her eyes were wide with a silent, terminal surprise, and her skin had the same awful, doll-like pallor. "Damn it," Cale whispered, his voice cracking. This time, there was a witness, a local teenager wrapped in a shock blanket in the back of a squad car. He was pale, shivering, his words tumbling out in a terrified rush. He'd been fishing downstream. He told Cale he saw the woman walking toward the rock. Then he saw something else. It wasn't a person, the boy stammered, his eyes darting toward the dark woods. It was tall, a shadow, but it was darker than the other shadows. It sort of moved without walking. It went right up to her. Evie listened, her skepticism warring with a cold knot of dread in her stomach. Eyewitness testimony, especially from a scared kid in the dark, was notoriously unreliable. What happened then, son? Cale asked gently. I felt it, the boy whispered, tears welling in his eyes. It got cold. So cold, like the cold that bites your bones. The woman, she just sat down, and the shadow was gone. Evie stood by the river's edge, the fog swirling around her ankles. The boy's words were the stuff of nightmares, of campfire stories, the kind of anecdotal, emotional data she was trained to discard. And yet, another body, another impossible death. And now, a terrified witness describing something that sounded less like a person and more like the personification of the curse itself. The neat, rational box Jedediah Blackwood had offered her shattered into 1,000 pieces, leaving her alone in the dark with a phenomenon that was actively, terrifyingly defying her science. Jedediah Blackwood's comforting words about mass hysteria had turned to ash in Evie's mouth. The terrified face of the young witness by the river, his talk of shadows and bone-deep cold, had demolished that neat psychological theory. Science demands that when a hypothesis fails, you discard it. Evie was left with her original nagging thesis, an environmental agent, something in the soil, the water, the air, something that emanated from a single source. And in Haven's Deep, all sources eventually led back to the Blackwood mine. The next morning, armed with a hazmat sampler kit and a grim sense of purpose, she made the hike. The trail was overgrown, a faint memory on the forest floor. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. The birdsong faded, replaced by an expectant hush. The mine entrance was a dark wound in the hillside, sealed with heavy, rotting timbers, and a grate of rusted iron that looked like broken teeth. A no trespassing sign, peppered with buckshot, hung askew. The air here was still and unnaturally cold, a stark contrast to the humid summer day. It was the cold the boy had described. As she scanned the area, her practiced eye caught something amiss. Clinging to the damp rocks near the sealed entrance was a patch of fungus. It was a pale, sickly white, its texture like soft leather. But as a cloud passed overhead, briefly dimming the sunlight, Evie saw it. The fungus pulsed with a faint internal light, a soft, ghostly luminescence, even in the middle of the day. Bioluminescence wasn't unheard of, but this was different. It was steady, hypnotic, a surge of professional excitement. The thrill of the hunt momentarily eclipsed her unease. This was it. This was tangible, a unique biological specimen at the heart of the mystery, a potential neurotoxin, a hallucinogen, something that could explain the visions, the fear. She was a scientist again, standing on the edge of a discovery. She opened her kit, her movements sure and steady, and prepared to take a sample. This was a piece of the puzzle she could take back to her world, a piece she could understand. She carefully used a pair of sterile tweezers to peel a small piece of the fungus from the rock. As she did, a low hum started. So faint at first, she thought it was the buzzing of an insect. But it grew steadily, a resonant frequency that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating up through the soles of her boots and into her bones. The hum climbed in pitch, becoming a powerful, disorienting drone that hammered at her skull. The world tilted. The trees around her seemed to stretch and warp, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The shadows on the forest floor elongated, writhing like living things. A wave of pure, primal terror, an emotion utterly separate from her intellect, washed over her. It was a chemical fear, absolute and unreasoning. Her fight or flight response fired with the force of a shotgun blast. She had to run. She had to get away. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The sealed sample container slipped from her grasp, falling to the rocks and shattering with a sickening crack. The piece of fungus, her one tangible clue, was lost. She didn't care. The only thought in her mind, the only command her brain could issue, was escape. She scrambled backward, tripping over a root, and pushed herself to her feet. Without a second glance, she turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, the unbearable hum chasing her all the way back to the world of silence. She was no longer an observer. She had become part of the experiment. Back in the cold, buzzing sanctuary of the makeshift morgue, Evie tried to force her world back into order. She cleaned her equipment with trembling hands, the methodical process, a familiar ritual against the chaos that was churning inside her. Her heart still hammered against her ribs. She could still feel the phantom vibration of that awful hum in her bones. She had been compromised. Her senses, the very tools she relied upon to interpret reality, had been hijacked. An email notification chimed on her laptop, a sharp digital sound that made her jump. It was from the State Lab, from a colleague she'd asked to run a more detailed analysis on Travis Miller's tissue samples. The subject line read, "Urgent query re, Haven's deep sample." She opened it, her stomach tightening. The report was a nightmare of scientific impossibilities. Her colleague, a man not given to hyperbole, had filled it with notes of disbelief. "Evie, are you sure this sample wasn't contaminated? The protein chains are unlike any I've ever encountered in human tissue." Further down, "The mass spec results are attached, but they make no sense. We're flagging trace elements that are, for lack of a better term, non-terrestrial. The atomic weights don't match anything known." The final line, a hastily added note at the bottom, was the one that made the air leave her lungs. Most bizarrely, the cellular decay process is abnormal. It's not necrosis or apoptosis. It's closer to a geological process. It mimics petrification. What the hell is going on up there? She leaned back, the printout shaking in her hand. The terror she had felt at the mine was subjective, a personal experience she could, perhaps, have dismissed as a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But this was objective. This was data. This was her own science screaming back at her that the impossible was real. The feeling of dread and the facts on the screen had just merged into one terrifying truth. She stormed into the sheriff's office like a whirlwind, her professional composure gone, replaced by a wild, frantic energy. She slapped the lab report down on Brody Cale's cluttered desk. "Look at it, Brody, just look," she urged, her voice high and strained. "Unidentifiable metals, unknown proteins. His cells are turning to stone. This isn't a disease, it's a transmutation." The words sounded insane, even to her own ears. She was speaking the language of alchemy, not pathology. Cale looked up from his paperwork, his face a mask of pure exhaustion. He looked from her wild eyes to the report, his expression not of shock, but of weary resignation. "Evie, and there's something at the mine," she pressed on, unstoppable. "A fungus, something that pulses with light, and there's a sound, a hum that gets inside your head and just breaks you." Cale held up a hand, silencing her. "Please, stop." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "The town council just left my office. They want this over. People are scared. They're locking their doors, keeping their kids home from school. They want an answer, any answer, that will let them sleep at night." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a weary sort of pity. "I can't give them this. I can't tell them a ghost fungus is turning people to rock. They'll run me out of town on a rail." "But it's the truth," Evie insisted, her voice cracking. "It's not a truth anyone can live with," he countered, his voice hardening with resolve. "I appreciate your help, Evie. I really do. But I'm closing the official investigation. You have 24 hours to pack up your gear. I'm ruling the deaths a series of tragic, unexplained natural events." "You're just going to give up?" she asked, incredulous. "No," he said, his gaze unwavering. I'm giving the town what it needs. I'm letting them have their ghost story." With those words, he stripped her of her authority, her purpose. He was officially abandoning the scientific process, surrendering to the narrative of the curse. Evie stood there, isolated and powerless, armed with impossible facts that no one would believe, a prophet of a science that sounded more terrifying than any superstition. Stripped of her authority and armed with an impossible truth, Evie felt the crushing weight of failure. Her science had led her to a place beyond belief, leaving her stranded and alone. There was nowhere left to turn. The official channels were closed. The path of logic had dissolved into madness. Defeated, she found herself drawn back to the one place in Haven's Deep that felt like a fixed point. The diner. It was late. The chrome and vinyl interior bathed in the soft glow of a single light above the counter. The diner was empty except for Alara Vance, who was quietly, methodically cleaning the grill, her movements slow and practiced. She looked up as Evie entered, her sharp eyes taking in the younger woman's disheveled appearance and the haunted look in her eyes. Without a word, Alara poured a cup of steaming herbal tea and set it on the counter. Evie slid onto a stool, the warmth of the mug a small comfort in the profound chill that had settled deep inside her. For a long moment she said nothing, just staring into the swirling tea. The arrogance was gone, the crisp, professional shield shattered. "Alara," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "The curse. You spoke of the men going mad." She looked up, her gaze meeting the older woman's. "Tell me about the madness." There was no triumph in Alara's expression, only a deep, weary understanding. She nodded slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked to a space behind the counter, bent down, and retrieved a heavy, leather-bound book from a hidden shelf. Its corners were worn smooth, the leather cracked with age. She laid it gently on the counter in front of Evie. "My grandfather was a timberman at the mine," Alara said softly. "He was part of the crew that sealed the entrance. He pulled out the first few bodies before the company called it off. He wrote things down, things he saw, things he heard." She pushed the journal closer to Evie. This was his. Evie looked from the old woman's face to the journal. It felt heavier than its weight, a vessel of memory and pain. This was a form of evidence she had been trained her entire life to dismiss. An anecdote, a story. But now, it was all she had left. She wrapped her hands around it, a silent acceptance. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a seeker, and she was finally willing to listen. Back in the sterile anonymity of her motel room, under the flickering hum of the cheap bedside lamp, Evie opened the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. The script was simple, that of a working man, the words spelled out with careful, deliberate strokes. It was a record of the disaster's aftermath, a raw, unfiltered account of horrors that had been scrubbed from the official histories. He wrote of the sounds. October 19th. We can still hear them. Not words anymore, just a pounding. Like a heart under the earth, he wrote of what he saw in the few bodies they recovered from the initial collapse, near the entrance. Their eyes were wide, not scared, just empty, like the soul had been scooped right out of them. And then, Evie found the passage that made her blood run cold. There is a deep humming sickness in the lower veins. The men who came up before the shaft fell in, they spoke of it. Said it made the dust dance and put shadows in the corners of your eyes, where there were no shadows. Said it planted a fear in you that wasn't your own. Evie's own experience at the mine entrance came rushing back. The oppressive hum, the warping vision, the wave of unreasoning terror. It was the same. A century apart, she and this long-dead timberman had felt the same impossible thing. She turned the page. There, sketched with a shaky but determined hand, was a crude map of the mine's tunnels. It was a labyrinth of lines and notations. The timberman had marked several of the deeper tunnels with a large, ominous X. Beside them, He'd written a single word: sickness. The journal was a Rosetta Stone. It was a key that could translate the language of superstition into the language of science. A deep, humming sickness became infrasound exposure. Shadows in the dust became optically induced hallucinations. A fear that wasn't your own became a primal neurological response to an unknown stimulus. With a surge of adrenaline, Evie turned to her laptop. She pulled up the geological survey maps of the area she had downloaded before leaving the state office. They were a web of precise, multicolored lines indicating magnetic fields, water tables, and seismic anomalies. She took a deep breath and dragged the scanned image of the timberman's crude drawing, overlaying it on top of the modern scientific map. It was a perfect match. Every single X the timberman had marked as a source of the sickness corresponded exactly to a deep, powerful magnetic and seismic anomaly on her geological survey. They were points of intense energy deep within the Earth. It was a stunning, impossible correlation of a ghost story with hard data. Her mind raced, connecting the points with frantic speed. She plotted the locations where the victims had been found. Travis Miller in the woods, the young woman by the river. They weren't random. When viewed on the map, they formed a clear, almost straight line leading away from the sealed mine entrance. A line that perfectly followed the path of a subterranean aquifer indicated on her survey. A horrifying realization dawned. A theory that synthesized everything: the science, the folklore, the impossible evidence. This wasn't a curse haunting a town. This wasn't a ghost seeking vengeance. This was a leak, a containment breach. Something was in that mine, something the Earth itself had tried to keep buried, and it was seeping out into the world. Armed with a new, terrifying thesis, Evie was no longer hunting a ghost. She was investigating a conspiracy. The next morning, she drove an hour out of Havens Deep to the dusty, quiet county records office. If the curse was a cover for a real physical secret, then the secret would have a paper trail. She sat at a humming microfilm reader, scrolling through decades of property records and corporate filings. She found what she was looking for in a set of deeds from 1928, the year after the disaster. Blackwood Industries hadn't sold off the land around their failed mine. They had quietly, systematically bought up all the surrounding parcels of land, creating a massive private buffer zone around the site. They weren't abandoning a tragedy, they were quarantining it. Then she searched for the most recent victim, the young woman found by the river. Her name was Catherine Hale. She wasn't a local. She wasn't on any town census. A quick search of her social media profile provided the final chilling piece of the puzzle. Catherine Hale was a postgraduate geologist. Her profile was full of pictures of rock formations and survey equipment. Her last post, from 2 days before her death, was a photo of the misty Appalachian hills with a caption: "Excited to start preliminary survey work for ARG Mining Corp. Some amazing deposits out here." It all clicked into place. Jedediah Blackwood's smooth, reasonable talk of generational trauma was a lie. The curse was a fence, a story weaponized to keep locals away, to scare off outsiders. And Catherine Hale wasn't a random victim of a wandering spirit. She was a threat, a geologist from a rival corporation, prospecting on the edge of his family's secret. Jedediah's motive wasn't to protect his town from a ghost. It was to protect a resource. And he was willing to let people die to keep it hidden. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture more monstrous than any ghost story. Jedediah Blackwood, it was all him. The knowledge settled in Evie's gut like a block of ice. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a confrontation. Thick fog swirled around her car as she drove up the winding road to the Blackwood estate one last time. The house loomed out of the mist, its windows like watchful eyes. She hadn't called Sheriff Cale. Not yet. A conspiracy this old, this deep, needed more than circumstantial evidence. She needed a confession, something tangible to shatter the century of lies. She found Jedediah in his study, the room filled with the ghosts of mining history and geological ambition. He was examining an old map, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his charismatic smile firmly in place, but his eyes were wary. He knew she hadn't come for a social call. "Dr. Reed," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "To what do I owe the late-night visit?" Evie didn't bother with pleasantries. She stood in the center of the room, a prosecutor delivering her closing argument. "It's not a curse, is it, Jedediah? It never was." She laid it all out. The fungus she'd found near the mine, its potent neurological effects, the impossible elements in the victim's blood, the convenient path of the underground aquifer. She told him she knew about the surveyor, Catherine Hale. She knew he was protecting something. "The curse is the most effective quarantine protocol I've ever seen," she finished, her voice steady and cold. "A ghost story to keep people away from a biological hazard. A story you and your family have been telling for 100 years. For a long moment, Jedediah was silent. The smile faded from his face, replaced by a slow, profound sadness. He looked at her, a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. He didn't deny it. He simply swirled the whiskey in his glass, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. "My grandfather didn't want to be a monster," he said quietly. "He just wanted to be a rich man." He walked to a large, ornate bookcase against the far wall. With a soft click, a section of the bookcase swung inward, revealing not a hidden passage, but a small vault-like chamber lined with lead. Inside, resting on velvet pedestals, were several large rocks. They glowed with the same pale, sickly, beautiful light she had seen at the mine entrance, pulsing gently in the dark. "He found it in the deepest vein," Jedediah continued, his voice taking on the tone of a weary tour guide. "A fungus growing on a bed of unique, undiscovered rare earth metals. A biological marvel. He thought it was the discovery of the century." Jedediah turned to face her fully. He was right. The fungus, when aerosolized, has profound neurological effects. The hum, the visions, the terror. You've experienced it, I imagine. He didn't wait for an answer. "But that's just the warning system. Prolonged exposure to the spores, direct inhalation. It causes a cascading cellular failure, a rapid, fatal petrification of organic tissue." He gestured to the glowing rocks. "The men in the mine, they didn't just suffocate. My family has been guarding this, studying it, for a century, keeping it safe. The recent deaths, unfortunate. The containment is weakening, and Ms. Hale, she was simply too curious." He looked at Evie, his expression now one of deep regret. "As are you, Doctor. You were exposed at the mine. You're contaminated. I'm truly sorry, but I can't allow you to leave." With a final sad smile, he stepped out of the study. The heavy oak door swung shut with a deafening thud, and the sharp metallic click of a heavy lock echoed in the sudden silence. Evie was trapped, alone in the room with the glowing, humming heart of the Blackwood Curse. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. The low hum from the hidden chamber was beginning to work its way into her skull again, a prelude to the terror she knew was coming. Her thoughts scattered, her scientific mind clouded by the rising tide of irrational fear. She fought it, clinging to her training, to the one solid thing in a world that had dissolved into a nightmare. Focus. It's biological. It has weaknesses. Analyze. Her mind raced back to the lab report, to the detailed chemical breakdown, the impossible proteins, the non-terrestrial metals, and one small overlooked note from the technician. Sample shows high reactivity to alkaline compounds. Alkaline, basic, the opposite of acidic. It was a lifeline. Her eyes darted around the room, a frantic inventory, a crystal decanter of whiskey on a silver tray, useless, old books, maps, and then she saw it, an antique liquor cabinet. She tore it open, her hands shaking. Inside, behind dusty bottles of brandy, was a seltzer bottle, the old-fashioned kind with a trigger still holding a charge. Beside the liquor cabinet, on a small table, sat a decorative ceramic bowl filled with what looked like mottled grey marbles. Potpourri. No, She recognized them from her grandmother's house. Old-fashioned lye-based soap balls used for scrubbing laundry. Lye, a powerful caustic alkaline. Her heart hammered in her chest as an idea, a desperate, brilliant gambit took shape. She knew Jedediah wouldn't leave her alone for long. She pulled out her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. She had Sheriff Cale on a preset emergency dial. She hit the call button and slid the phone into her pocket, leaving the line open. "It's a shame, Doctor." Jedediah's voice drifted through the thick door. "You truly are a remarkable woman." She ignored him, her focus absolute. She grabbed a heavy bookend, crushed one of the soap balls into a coarse powder on the silver tray, and funneled the dust into the seltzer bottle. She shook it violently, the water fizzing and churning into a milky chemical slurry, a crude chemical aerosolizer, a weapon born of science and desperation. The heavy lock on the door began to turn. Evie raised the seltzer bottle, her hands steady now, her fear replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. As Jedediah Blackwood pushed the door open to look upon his latest victim, she pulled the trigger. A powerful jet of the alkaline solution sprayed across the room, dousing the glowing rocks in the hidden chamber. The effect was instantaneous. The rocks hissed like water on a hot skillet, their pale lights sputtering and dimming. The oppressive, mind-breaking hum stopped so abruptly, the resulting silence was deafening. Jedediah stared, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. Evie didn't wait. She bolted past him, out of the study and into the main hall, gasping for the clean, untainted air. As she burst out of the front door and onto the foggy lawn, the night was ripped apart by the sound of approaching sirens. Sheriff Cale's cruiser, lights flashing, screeched to a halt at the end of the driveway. Cale apprehended a stunned Jedediah, who offered no resistance, his century-old secret neutralized by a soap ball and a seltzer bottle. Evie stood on the grass, her lungs burning, the cool night air a blessed relief. She looked back at the grand house, no longer a symbol of power, but a tomb of secrets. She had arrived in Haven's Deep, a scientist, certain of the world's rules. She would leave as something else, something more, a woman who would walk through the looking glass, where superstition and science were just two different words for the same terrifying truth, and had found her way back. On the surface, this story seems to follow a familiar path. A rational scientist arrives in a superstitious town and, after a few strange encounters, neatly debunks the local legend with a logical explanation. We expect the curse to be revealed as a rare toxin or a case of mass hysteria. But the brilliance of this narrative is how it completely inverts that expectation. The scientific truth isn't a simple, comforting answer. It's something far more terrifying and alien than any ghost story. The reality is a fungus that communicates through infrasound, growing on impossible metals, causing a fatal petrification of human tissue. The science is actually the horror. This transforms the town's superstition from a quaint, ignorant belief into a vital piece of cultural technology. The Blackwood Curse wasn't a story born from fear of the unknown. It was a story weaponized to contain a known but incomprehensible danger. It was a quarantine protocol built from folklore. The tale of vengeful spirits was, in its own way, a shield protecting the town from a truth so monstrous it defied explanation. It suggests that some truths are so corrosive, we have to invent simpler, more manageable fictions just to survive them. It leaves us with a truly difficult question. If you had to choose, would you rather live with a comforting lie or a terrifying, incomprehensible truth?